So I had some time to talk yesterday with everybody, and I don't know, I think everyone probably, there was some people that weren't in the room. We talked about a few things. I'm going to cover some of those things a little bit, and then we're going to get into the main topic. And one of the things I talked about yesterday was there were two studies done last year. One was by McKinsey, one was done by MIT. And the MIT one talked about the idea that 95% of Gen AI initiatives didn't actually go anywhere, right? They didn't benefit the companies, they didn't benefit the audience that they needed. There was only about 5% that actually had any use. And then McKinsey, what they said was, out of all the projects out there, the uptake of AI in general, RAG and all these other things that go on with AI, was about 80% with companies. So there's a lot of uptake and a lot of usage of AI, but not a lot of benefit from AI. And I want you to think about that as we go on a little bit, right? Because we're going to go back in history, and we're going to see that time again. And so I want to kind of point this out, because the important thing to understand is, you know, people tell us we're living in unprecedented times, and things are moving really fast, and things are going on. But, you know, you have to wonder to yourself, what is it exactly? What is going on? What is so unprecedented? And what is happening? And really, what should I be concerned about? And so, you know, as I sit up here and I think about what to say about AI, you know, people think that, you know, like I'm one of the experts, or I'm one of the guys that knows, but I'm really not, right? I think it's mostly the people in the room that need to be the experts. And so I look at it as you guys need to be the experts. And so what is it that I can say to you about the unprecedented times and the things you should be concerned about and things you should be doing based upon the things that I do, which is work with a lot of companies, see what works, what doesn't work, those kind of things. And so that's what I'd like to get into. But to do that, you've got to start with a little bit of historical context, right? So if you stay with me, I think we can get through this. It'll be kind of interesting. Maybe. We'll see. In about 1903, human beings left the ground for the first time, right? We finally had the Wright brothers plane fly, right? It was a fragile machine, which is fabric, wood. Took off for about 12 seconds, over a field in North Carolina. No one watching that flight really understood the implications of what would happen next. And 66 years later after that, we landed on the moon. So if you think about that, in one lifetime, we didn't fly at all, right? We started flying, and the next thing we're on the moon, right? That took one lifetime, 66 years. So get a feel for the speed of the transition of progress, right? We're really moving a lot faster than we think we are, right? And this was a while ago. It only took like 66 years, right? So it didn't happen slowly. It happened because that progress didn't move in a straight line, right? That progress tended to compound. And when progress compounds, right, it doesn't ask for permission in general, right? And every generation thinks it's living through an unprecedented change, but most are wrong. This really right here is the unprecedented change, right? What we're in now. And some moments, they're not always about the pace of things, but they are about the direction of things. And, the story of progress is not a smooth ascent. It's, more of a pattern, right? And every time that pattern repeats, there's a blind spot. And in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, right, something interesting happened, right? It wasn't just the Industrial Revolution that happened, but when it did happen, the productivity exploded, right? Factories became more efficient. The output increased at a scale that they'd never seen. But the one thing that didn't change was wages, right? Wages didn't change at that time. For the next 50 years, wages remained about the same, right? There was, that period had a name, right? That period was called Engels' pause, right? Based after a mathematician back in the day in the 1600s that talked about this, that actually crunched the data, like one of the first data scientist guys back in the day went through all the wages and figured this out. It wasn't really a failure of invention. It was mainly a failure of translation, right? The society didn't yet know how to convert technology into broad economic benefit, right? So I don't know if that sounds familiar, but it kind of does, right? It kind of happens again. The institutions, they lag behind the innovation. Policies move slowly. The governments kind of assumed continuity, right? They didn't assume things were really going to change. And meanwhile, that reality had already shifted underneath them. Efficiency rose, the wealth concentrated, but social pressure, because of the wages, right, accumulated. And it wasn't because the technology was malicious, but it's because the leadership was unprepared for the consequences of what was going to happen. And every major technological leap, it creates this moment, right? A gap between what is possible and what society is structured to absorb. And that gap is where that instability lives, right? Every generation is convinced it's going to manage that gap better than the last, and every generation believes it's going to move faster. But if you look at history, it just suggests otherwise, right? So that's kind of why I wanted to look back on that. And the question is not whether technology is going to outrun your institution. The question is whether this time that distance will be wide enough to fracture them. And every tech revolution feels overwhelming to the people living through it, but they follow a familiar pattern, right? Steam engines replace muscle, electricity scale production, right? Computers, automated calculation. But each wave changed how fast we could work, and each wave changed how much we could produce. But none of them beforehand, right? None of them changed who decided. And human judgment remained that bottleneck until now. Artificial intelligence is not a faster tool. It's not a better calculator, and it's not another productivity layer. It's a first general purpose technology that scales judgment itself, right? For the first time, interpretation is no longer scarce, right? We're moving from automated tasks to automated decisions. It's not creativity, it's not morality, it's not leadership, but judgment. And judgment in this case means the ability to evaluate options, detect patterns, determine likely outcomes, right? And that's a distinction that matters. Because throughout history, power has always followed judgment. Whoever could see earlier, decide faster, act with confidence, that's who shaped events rather than reacted to them. And artificial intelligence doesn't remove humans from decision making. But what it does is it changes the velocity at which that decision is formed. And once judgment becomes scalable, power then reorganizes. And that's why every previous comparison, every industrial revolution to this one falls short, right? It's not another industrial upgrade. It's a structural shift in how intelligence itself is produced, distributed, and applied. And structures, not technologies, are what ultimately determine winners and losers, right? When power reorganizes, it reorganizes around a resource. In earlier centuries, that resource was land, right? You controlled territory, you controlled the wealth, the food, the security. In the 20th century, power followed energy. It followed, it was oil, electricity, industrial capacity. But in the 21st, it operates under a different logic. Today, power follows data, right? And it's not because data is valuable on its own. It's because it's the data that feeds the intelligence that we have now. And intelligence, when deliberately directed, reshapes the economies, securities, and the governance. You hear a familiar story about data is the new oil, but it's not, right? It's not the new oil because oil gets depleted, right? It's extracted once it's burned, right? It's used up. But data is not like that, right? Data compounds, right? It becomes more valuable the more you use it, right? And crucially, data doesn't become intelligence on its own. It requires something. It requires compute, it requires models, it requires governance. And that's why you suddenly see all these nations suddenly rewriting all their assumptions, right? Everyone's trying to figure it out now, right? You've got data localization laws, sovereign cloud strategies. I think, Baroness, you mentioned this, right? National AI platforms, semiconductor supply chains, energy security for data centers, right? All of this is suddenly not just an individual, like a company problem, right? Now it's a bigger problem, right? How many of you 2 years ago, would have been comfortable putting all your data on AWS and Azure, right? It would have been not a big deal. Today, national data on Microsoft's or AWS, yeah, I don't know. Right? Maybe something to think about. But these aren't technology initiatives, right? They're expressions of sovereignty. And whoever controls the flow of data and the infrastructure that turns it into intelligence shapes how those decisions are made at scale, right? And in the 19th century, power followed the boards, like we said, right? In the 20th, it followed pipelines. And in the 21st, it's going to follow those who can direct intelligence across systems continuously and at speed. This is why global competition around AI begins to feel different. It's not because it's not just about technological leadership alone. It's about the jurisdiction over that intelligence. Much of the public conversation around AI, is distracted by the wrong fears, right? People think about AI taking over, systems acting independently. While that's, a little bit compelling, but it's not really relevant, right? AI is not going to really overthrow a government. The governments that can't deploy intelligence, right, will find themselves overtaken by those who can. And the real risk is not runaway systems, it's institutional paralysis, right? You consider the mismatch we're living with already, right? Policy cycles measured in years, budget cycles measured in quarters, right? Electoral cycles, measured in mandates. Intelligence systems can evolve in months, sometimes weeks. Ministries operate in silos, data is fragmented, insight is delayed. By the time decisions are made, the conditions that inform them have already changed. It's not a failure of intent, it's a failure of tempo. And leaders are expected to govern complex systems with partial visibility and outdated feedback. While automated systems outside the public sector detect patterns, anticipate outcomes, and adjust continuously, there's an asymmetry there that matters, right? It's not intelligence versus humanity, but intelligence at scale, versus the governance without it. The danger isn't that the machines will make decisions for us. It's that the decisions will increasingly be made without those in power fully understanding the systems they are governing, right? Power without understanding becomes somewhat symbolic. And history is unforgiving, right, to institutions that lose their ability to see. If this was only a story about risk, it would end in, paralysis. But history shows us something else, right? Every moment of disruption also reveals a new foundation. We're beginning to see what that foundation is now. Artificial intelligence is not an application layer. It's not a pilot program, it's not a department, not a chatbot. It's an intelligence layer, one that sits beneath policy, beneath institutions, and beneath every system that governs modern society: healthcare, transportation, energy, taxation, education, security. Those are not isolated domains, they are interconnected systems, and intelligence flows across them. The opportunity before us is not faster reaction, it is earlier understanding. And the most capable governments of the next decade will not move faster after crises emerge. They'll see that pressure building, and they'll see it before the crises actually form. They'll simulate outcomes before committing policy. And they'll detect stress, economic, social, logistical, while it's still reversible. And that's what an intelligence infrastructure enables, right? It's not automation of authority, it's augmentation of perception. And the shift required is not a technological one, it's architectural, right? From fragmented systems to connected intelligence, from delayed reporting to continuous insight. When intelligence becomes infrastructure, governance no longer waits, for events, it shapes them. And every era leaves behind a simple question for its leaders. It's not a technical one, it's a historical one, right? In some eras, leadership meant commanding armies. In others, it meant organizing markets, building institutions, or guiding nations through industrial change. Every generation was tested on what it could see and what it could respond to. But this era, this time, asked for something different. It asks whether leadership can exist in a world where intelligence is instantaneous, because authority no longer rests only on position, it rests on understanding. And understanding now moves faster than titles, committees, or procedure, right? And that creates that uncomfortable feeling that I talked about yesterday, right? That feeling in the pit of your stomach about something changing, something going on, can't quite put your finger on it, right? It's, those who govern the slow systems are now surrounded by faster ones. Systems that learn continuously, they adapt automatically, they reveal patterns long before they surface in a report. And leadership doesn't engage these systems. It does not remain neutral, right? It becomes reactive, and over time, somewhat symbolic. It's not a question of expertise. No leader is expected to design models or manage the code. The question is simpler and harder, right? Can you govern in a world where perception itself has accelerated? And if not, who will, right? Moments like this do not announce themselves as historic. They feel administrative, right? Decision framed as delays, trade-offs described as caution, fragmentation justified as complexity, right? But history records it differently. Delay is not neutrality, and fragmentation isn't safety. But inaction is still a decision. That's probably, if I have to say anything today, right, that's the real thing to say. Inaction is still a decision, just not one we will retain control over. The future will be shaped by those who learn to work with intelligence at scale, and it's not because they're more ambitious, but because they are more prepared. History doesn't judge leaders by the technologies available to them. It judges them by whether they built institutions capable of using those technologies wisely. Artificial intelligence isn't a test of innovation, it's a test of governance. And governance, at its best, is a discipline of seeing clearly and acting deliberately in advance of a crisis. And that future will not be governed by those who speak about artificial intelligence, guys like me. It'll be governed by those who learn to direct intelligence deliberately, responsibly, and at scale. Thank you.